November 3rd, 1944. Nancy, France. 02:17 in the morning. 7 American trucks came into the supply yard so fast the sentries thought the gates were about to come off their hinges. Mud hit the canvas walls. Chains slapped against tailgates. One truck had no left headlamp. Another came in dragging a strip of torn fender that screamed against the stone like a saw. And the lead truck was still smoking. Its windshield was spider-webbed. Its radiator grill was punched through in 3 places. A dark line of oil followed it across the yard like a wound that had learned how to move. The driver killed the engine before the truck had fully stopped. The door opened, and Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks dropped into the mud with both boots, one hand on the door frame, the other pressed against a folded stack of delivery papers inside his jacket. He was 36 years old, black, from Birmingham, Alabama. A truck driver in an army that needed truck drivers more desperately than it knew how to admit. Nobody in that yard knew his name yet, but they were about to remember it. Because less than 1 minute later, a clean young lieutenant standing under a dry canvas awning would refuse to return Brooks's salute. And before the rain had time to wash the oil from the stones, a 3-star general would step into that same mud and salute the truck driver first. That was the moment the yard went silent. But to understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand what was really holding the war together by the fall of 1944. Not the maps, not the speeches, not the photographs of tanks crossing open country. The war was being held together by gasoline cans, tire patches, brake lines, manifest books, exhausted mechanics, and men who drove until their hands locked around the steering wheel. After the Normandy breakout, the Allied armies moved faster than their supply system was built to follow. Tanks could outrun railroads. Infantry could outrun field kitchens. Artillery could burn through shells faster than depots could sort them. A map could show a bold arrow sweeping across France. But a Sherman tank did not move on arrows. It moved on fuel. It fought with ammunition. It waited for spare parts, rations, medical crates, radio batteries, grease, boots, blankets, and the 1,000 ordinary things nobody paints into heroic battle scenes. By late summer, American commanders were facing a brutal truth. The German army was wounded. The roads were open. The opportunity was there. And the advance was in danger of stopping because the cargo was still hundreds of miles behind the guns. So the army built a road on top of other roads. They called it the Red Ball Express, a one-way military highway loop, running day and night, from the Normandy beaches toward the front. No civilian traffic, no sightseeing, no pause because the weather turned bad. At its peak, roughly 6,000 vehicles were moving through that system. In 83 days, the Red Ball Express carried more than 400,000 tons of supplies across France. And most of the men driving those trucks were Black American soldiers, men who served inside a segregated army, men who were trusted with ammunition, fuel, and the survival of entire divisions, but not trusted by that same institution with equal rank, equal promotion, or equal treatment. That was the contradiction riding in every cab. Elijah Brooks understood it before he ever set foot in Europe. He had grown up in Birmingham with the kind of knowledge that did not come from books. He knew which door to enter, which counter not to sit at, which white man expected silence, which silence might keep you alive. He entered the army in 1942 and learned that a uniform could cover a man without protecting him from the country that issued it. So Brooks did what many men like him did. He became useful beyond argument. He learned the engine by sound. He learned when a clutch was about to fail by the vibration through his left boot. He could tell whether a bridge would hold a loaded truck by watching the first 6 feet of timber flex under the front tires. In North Africa, he drove water to men who had stopped sweating because they had nothing left in them. In Sicily, he hauled ammunition on switchback roads, where one wrong turn meant a fall long enough to say a prayer. In France, he drove blackout roads so dark the convoy ahead of him existed only as 2 tiny slits of red paint catching moonlight. He did not become famous. He did not become an officer. He became one of the men the war leaned on without turning around to look. By November 1944, Brooks had logged more miles in active combat zones than most officers would travel in their entire military careers. His hands had split open and healed over so many times the skin looked like old leather. He had seen trucks burn. He had seen drivers fall asleep upright and wake up in ditches. He had seen men killed by weather, fatigue, and maintenance delays long before an enemy bullet found them. And on the night of November 2nd, his convoy was ordered to run a priority load east toward a forward artillery group that had been firing faster than expected. The cargo was not glamorous. No flags, no secret orders, no general's luggage. Just shell crates, fuel drums, medical boxes, tire chains, replacement belts, and 24 sacks of field rations that smelled like damp paper and coffee dust. The route should have taken 6 hours. It took 11. Rain had turned the road into a trench. A bridge outside Toul had been damaged by retreating German engineers, forcing the convoy through a farm lane barely wide enough for a truck with both mirrors folded in. Then, 3 miles past midnight, the hedgerow on the right side of the road opened up. The first burst hit the second truck. A tire exploded. A headlamp shattered. The driver swerved, corrected, and kept moving. Brooks did not stop. That decision saved the convoy. A stopped truck on a narrow road becomes a plug. A stopped convoy becomes a target. And an artillery battery without shells by dawn becomes a line of men waiting for help that cannot arrive. Brooks leaned on the horn twice, the convoy signal for push through. He took the lead truck straight into the fire. Not because he was fearless. Fear was in the cab with him. Fear was in his throat, and under his ribs, and in the cold sweat at the back of his neck. But fear was not driving. Training was. Judgment was. A man who knew the road, knew the cargo, and knew that hesitation could kill men he would never meet. A round came through the windshield high enough to miss his face by inches. Another punched through the hood. A third cracked the fuel gauge, leaving glass glittering on the floorboards. He drove by the sound of the engine and the shadow of the road. The truck behind him took fire, but stayed in line. The wounded driver in the second truck wrapped his own shoulder with a torn shirt and kept one hand on the wheel. The last truck nearly slid off the road at a bend, then lurched back into the lane with chains screaming under the tires. By the time the convoy reached Nancy, all 7 trucks were still moving. That was the victory. Not clean, not cinematic, not the kind that gets a photographer assigned to it. 7 trucks arrived. The cargo arrived. The guns would keep firing in the morning. Brooks climbed down with his manifest papers under his coat and walked toward the depot office. He was cold. He was soaked. His right cheek was cut from windshield glass. His boots were so heavy with mud that each step made a wet, tearing sound. Under the awning, 5 officers stood around a folding table with coffee cups and dry cloths. At the front of them was Lieutenant Harold Whitcomb, 24 years old, graduate of a fine school. Polished boots, a raincoat that looked as though it had been issued that morning and had not yet learned what war smelled like. Brooks saw the bars on Whitcomb's collar. He stopped, straightened, and raised his hand in a proper military salute. Whitcomb looked at him. then looked at the muddy truck behind him, then looked back at Brooks, and turned away. Not quickly, not accidentally, slowly enough for everyone under the awning to understand what he was doing. Brooks's hand stayed at his brow for 1 second too long. Then it came down. His face did not change. Men who have spent a lifetime being insulted in public learn how to keep their faces from giving the insult anything extra to feed on. Brooks adjusted the papers inside his jacket and started walking again. What he did not know was that someone else had seen it. 15 yards away, beside a dark command car, Lieutenant General Edmund Pike had been speaking to the depot quartermaster about cargo delays. Pike was not a gentleman. He was not a sentimental man. He was not in that yard to make anyone feel better. He cared about speed. He cared about discipline. He cared about whether supplies reached fighting men before fighting men ran out of what they needed. And what he had just watched was not merely disrespect. It was inefficiency wearing manners like a clean coat. The general stepped away from the command car. No aide announced him. No one called the yard to attention. He walked through the rain, past the officers under the awning, past Whitcomb, past the folding table and the steaming coffee, until he reached the rear of Brooks's damaged truck. "Sergeant." Brooks turned. He saw the 3 stars on the general's helmet and immediately began to lift his hand again. He never finished, because the general's hand was already at the brim of his own helmet. A full salute, sharp, formal, held. Every wrench in that yard seemed to stop in the air. A mechanic stood frozen with both hands inside an open engine compartment. 2 drivers halfway through unloading ammunition crates simply stopped moving. Somewhere behind the depot office, a mule brayed once. Then the sound died into the rain. Brooks stared at the general. Then, slowly, he returned the salute. His hand trembled. Not much. Just enough for the men closest to see that the moment had reached him somewhere deeper than anger. The general lowered his hand. Then he turned toward the awning. "Lieutenant Whitcomb." The lieutenant took 1 step forward. His face had gone pale. "Sir, come here." Whitcomb walked into the mud. Not around it. Through it. His polished boots sank at once. The general waited until Whitcomb stood beside Brooks's truck. Then Pike pointed at the bullet holes in the hood. "What is that?" Whitcomb swallowed. "Enemy fire, sir." Pike pointed at the oil streak behind the truck. "And that?" "Damage from the road, sir." Pike pointed to the manifest papers under Brooks's arm. "And that?" "Cargo record, sir." "No." The general's voice stayed low. "That is why my artillery will not be silent tomorrow morning." The yard did not breathe. Pike looked from Whitcomb to the officers under the awning. "You saw a muddy uniform and decided the man inside it was beneath your courtesy. I see 7 trucks that arrived after someone tried to stop them. I see fuel, shells, food, and medical boxes that are now where my army needs them." His voice hardened. "You salute rank because regulations require it. You respect competence because war requires it." Whitcomb opened his mouth, closed it. The general stepped closer. "The next time a man brings my supplies through fire, Lieutenant, you will not ask what color his hands are before you remember your manners." Then he looked at Brooks. "Staff Sergeant, did this officer return your salute?" Brooks's jaw tightened. "No, sir." Pike turned back to Whitcomb. "Corrected." Whitcomb stood there for 1 terrible second. Then he raised his hand and saluted Brooks in front of the entire yard. "I apologize, Staff Sergeant Brooks. My conduct was disrespectful and contrary to military discipline." Brooks returned the salute. "Accepted, sir." 2 words, no triumph in them, no performance, no revenge. Just a man receiving what should never have been denied to him. That should have been the end of it. But systems do not fear speeches. They fear paperwork. And General Pike, for all his temper, understood paperwork as well as artillery. Before leaving the depot, he asked for 3 things: maintenance priority logs, convoy delay reports, and the last 90 days of disciplinary complaints involving truck drivers. Colonel Milton Sayers, the depot commander, tried to soften the request. He spoke about morale, about old habits, about the difficulty of managing tension in rear areas, about not disturbing a working system too abruptly. Pike looked at him as though he had just heard a man explain why a bridge should remain half-broken because people were used to crossing it carefully. "Colonel," he said, "if your system delays my ammunition, it is not working." By noon the next day, the review had begun. By the 3rd day, the numbers were worse than anyone expected. Black drivers were waiting longer for repairs, even when their trucks carried higher priority cargo. White-driven vehicles were being moved ahead in the maintenance queue on informal orders. Complaints had been buried as personality conflicts. 2 convoy delays had forced artillery units to ration shells during active fire missions. 1 infantry company had spent an entire morning without expected medical resupply because a truck with a cracked fuel line had been left untouched behind vehicles with cosmetic damage. The paper did what humiliation could not do. It made the pattern measurable. Colonel Sayers was relieved of command before the month ended. The official language was clean: failure to maintain operational throughput, improper maintenance prioritization, inefficient administration under combat conditions. No one wrote that he had defended insult as order. No one had to. The numbers were enough. As for Lieutenant Whitcomb, he was reassigned to a rifle platoon near the front before the week was over. He arrived there carrying the stiff pride of a man who had been corrected publicly and had not yet decided whether the correction was justice or injury. The front answered that question for him, not with wisdom, with artillery. On his 2nd night, a shell landed close enough to lift dirt into his helmet and fill his mouth with the taste of stone. On his 3rd day, a private from Iowa showed him how to move low across a ditch because Whitcomb's academy training had taught the method, but fear had erased the body memory. On his 5th day, his platoon ran short of mortar rounds while trying to hold a tree line in freezing rain. The resupply truck came late, very late. When it finally arrived, the driver was a black corporal from Georgia with red eyes and both sleeves soaked dark from the weather. Whitcomb watched that man jump down, open the tailgate, and start passing crates forward without waiting for permission. And something in him broke in the proper direction. Not a dramatic conversion, not a clean moral scene, a smaller and harder thing. Recognition. He saw the chain. Road to truck, truck to shell, shell to position, position to living men. A salute refused at the wrong end of that chain was not merely ugly. It was stupid. And in war, stupidity had bodies attached to it. After that day, Whitcomb became known in his company for one habit. He saluted first whenever a convoy came in under fire, no matter who stepped out of the cab. Men laughed about it at first. Then they stopped laughing, because he did it the same way every time. Not as apology theater, as discipline. Elijah Brooks never heard about that change. He kept driving. He drove through November rain, December ice, and the long white misery that settled over Europe when winter turned every road into a test of will. The Red Ball Express, as an official route, would eventually end. Rail lines would be repaired. Supply systems would shift. The front would move. The war would grind toward Germany through snow, hunger, and exhaustion. But men like Brooks did not vanish when the name of the route changed. They kept hauling. Fuel 1 week, rations the next. Spare tracks for tanks, blankets for field hospitals, mailbags swollen from rain and hope, wooden crates marked with stencils so dull that only a supply sergeant could love them. He received one commendation for the Nancy run. It arrived months later, folded inside an envelope with language so formal it seemed almost embarrassed by the blood behind it. For exceptional judgment under enemy fire, for preservation of cargo and personnel, for maintaining movement under hazardous conditions. Brooks read it once, then put it in the same metal box where he kept his pay records and a photograph of his mother. The war ended in May. Europe celebrated in streets full of flags and broken glass. Brooks came home to Alabama in late 1945 and discovered that victory had crossed the ocean more easily than equality had. He applied for a loan to buy his own truck. Denied. Insufficient collateral. He tried another bank. Denied again. A white veteran he knew, younger than him, with less time overseas and no convoy service, received a similar loan that same month. Brooks did not shout in the bank. He did not beg. He did not tell the clerk about the bullet holes in Nancy, or the general's salute, or the men whose artillery kept firing because he had refused to stop in the road. He simply folded the papers and walked out. This was not surrender. This was route finding. A man who has driven through cratered roads does not expect the road to become fair just because he deserves it. He looks for a passable lane. Brooks took work driving for a freight company that paid poorly and expected more hours from him than from men with lighter skin and lighter records. He learned the southern highways the way he had learned the French roads. Which diner would serve him from the back door? Which gas station would let him use the restroom? Which police checkpoints asked questions for sport? Which loading dock foreman could be trusted to count honestly? He saved in small amounts that would have looked impossible to a man who had never been denied a clean start. In 1951, he bought a used International truck with bad paint, a stubborn gearbox, and an engine he understood better than the salesman did. In 1957, he owned 2 trucks. By 1962, he had a modest route that carried hardware, seed, paper goods, and machine parts across 3 states. Not an empire, not a headline, a living. Built one paid invoice at a time. His children grew up knowing their father had been in the war, but not knowing the story from Nancy. He did not tell it. Not because it meant nothing, because some moments sit too deep for ordinary conversation. What they did see was the way he moved through the world. He called every waiter sir or ma'am, no matter how they treated him. He paid his drivers on time. He kept maintenance records so clean that inspectors ran out of things to criticize. He never let a customer talk down to one of his men in his presence. And if a young driver came back ashamed because someone had refused him simple respect at a warehouse or fueling station, Brooks would not give him a speech. He would hand him a wrench, point at the truck, and say, "Get the cargo there clean, then make them read your paperwork." That was his gospel. Not loud, not soft, practical. Years passed. The Army changed in documents before it changed in habits. Executive orders were signed. Committees met. Policies moved through offices. Units integrated by necessity, resistance, and the hard arithmetic of war. The country changed too. Not all at once. Never as quickly as the speeches claimed. Never without people paying for every inch. Brooks watched it from truck stops, living rooms, loading docks, and courthouse steps. He heard names on the radio that would become history. Montgomery, Little Rock, Birmingham, Selma, Sometimes the road he drove for work passed within miles of a place where the nation was arguing, bleeding, and pretending not to understand what had always been obvious. His wife once asked him, after the evening news showed men screaming at children outside a school, whether the war had changed anything. Brooks sat quietly for a long time. Then he said, "It changed what they could deny on paper." And that was not enough. But it was not nothing. In 1978, a military historian writing about wartime logistics called Brooks after finding his name in a convoy citation. The historian wanted numbers, routes, truck models, fuel loads, delivery schedules. Brooks gave him all of it. Precise, patient, without romance. At the end of the call, the historian asked, "What do you wish people understood about the drivers?" Brooks was silent long enough that the man thought the line had gone dead. Then Brooks said, "We were the road." That sentence appeared years later in a book few people bought at first, then many researchers learned to depend on. Brooks's name appeared twice. The salute did not appear at all, because Brooks never mentioned it. The general who had saluted him died after the war in a stateside accident. Lieutenant Whitcomb lived quietly in Maryland and spent 20 years managing a shipping office where, according to his son, he became almost severe about treating drivers with respect. Colonel Sayers retired without promotion and never publicly discussed the depot review. Their lives moved away from Nancy, but the moment did not. Nothing that happens in front of 200 witnesses truly disappears. It breaks apart into smaller things. A mechanic who had seen the general salute Brooks began moving priority repairs by cargo classification instead of driver identity. A clerk stopped burying complaints from black convoy men at the bottom of the stack. A captain at the front started asking who was actually late and why, before blaming the trucks. A lieutenant who had once turned his back learned to lift his hand first. None of that made the system just. But every unjust system depends on people behaving as though the small correction is not worth making. The yard in Nancy proved otherwise. In 1984, Elijah Brooks died at the age of 76. The funeral was held on a humid afternoon in Birmingham, in a church with old fans moving warm air over polished wood. His family filled the front rows. Drivers from his company stood along the aisle in dark suits. 3 veterans came in slowly, 2 with canes, 1 with a folded envelope in his breast pocket. They had driven with him in France. After the service, they stood beside the casket. One by one, they raised their hands. 3 old men saluting another old man who had kept cargo moving when the world tried to stop. His daughter found the metal box that evening. Inside were pay records, a photograph of his mother, a grease-stained maintenance notebook, a faded unit picture, and the commendation from the Nancy run. At the bottom of the box was a second piece of paper she had never seen, a copied memo forwarded years after the war by a veteran who had worked in a records office. It was short. Depot review confirms discriminatory maintenance delays produced measurable operational loss. Recommend promotion review for Staff Sergeant E. Brooks. Convoy performance indicates command judgment beyond current grade. No promotion had followed. No ceremony. No corrected rank on his headstone. Just the paper. His daughter read it twice. Then she understood something her father had understood long before her. Recognition that arrives too late is not useless, but it is not justice. It is evidence. Evidence that the work was real. Evidence that the failure was known. Evidence that the man had carried more than cargo. He had carried the Army's contradiction in the cab beside him, and still delivered what he was ordered to deliver. That is why the story matters. Not because one general's salute repaired a segregated army. It did not. Not because one public apology erased a lifetime of insult. It could not. It matters because, for 1 minute in the rain, the hierarchy reversed and told the truth. The clean boots were not holding the army together. The muddy ones were. And Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks, who had driven through gunfire with shell crates in the back and glass on the floorboards, did not need the salute to become worthy of respect. He had been worthy before the general raised his hand. The salute only forced everyone else to admit it. The truck arrived. The cargo arrived. The road held. And the road remembered what the roster did not.